Welcome everyone to our first PlantChat webinar. On the screen you'll see Sam in the middle there and my colleague Brad from the partnership on the end. I want to open by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of this unceded land, Canberra, the Ngunnawal people, and their elders past and present. I also want to extend that respect to all First Nations people as the traditional owners and custodians of this country, and honour their cultural and spiritual connection and their deep knowledge and care of country. Finally, I want to further acknowledge all First Nations people joining us here today. Now, before I introduce you to Sam and her research, I'm going to give you a very fast rundown on the Seedbank Partnership, this being our first webinar. Now, the partnership is one of those unique national collaborations that has stood the test of time. We're 20 years strong. We involve 11 conservation seed banks and the key plant conservation organisations around Australia. The partnership is supported by a small secretariat, which is Brad and myself. We're hosted at Parks Australia at the Australian National Botanic Gardens, and we work up projects with our partners, we fundraise, we prospect for grants, and we communicate the work of our partners. And I'd just like to say welcome to, there's a number of our partners. James from Tasmania, I saw you coming into the webinar. Now, the focus of our work is to actually secure the seed of plants, and primarily they're the species that are of conservation concern. We want to place these plants into collections and store them for two key reasons. The first is so we've got an insurance population against the loss of our native flora, and it's worth noting there's over 1,400 threatened plant species and the list is growing. We also want to ensure that that genetic material is available for conservation recovery and biological research. Now, our partners don't just collect seed, they're busy conducting germination trials to see how we germinate those plants. Some seeds grown on in living collections and some is propagated for plants to translocate and for restoration projects. Finally, and the sort of rationale for our seminar is our work is about sharing that knowledge using webinars like this. So the message today, and Sam's talk is highly relevant, is that plant conservation is the foundational activity that we need for nature repair. It's key to 5 of the 6 national targets that have just been agreed to by Australian government ministers to meet our global targets under the CBD. And these targets will be presented at COP16 in October this year. Also at the CBD COP in October this year, there'll be an updated global strategy for plant conservation, which will show how those plant conservation activities will contribute to the targets. Now, the other reason that we want to hold these webinars is because we as a nation and also a global community suffer from what is termed plant blindness. And you can read more about this cognitive bias. But what it means is that there's much less resources and effort going into plant conservation. Our activities receive significantly less support than conservation of vertebrates. And this is despite plant conservation generally being cheaper to deliver on a per species basis, and lots of no-regret measures. I should mention the invertebrates also miss out in this space. And now to Sam and her extremely timely research with her colleagues that kind of illustrates the point we've just made. There's been very little invested in enabling the important native seed industry that we need to deliver on those restoration targets. And I want you to think about what we've been through as a country over the last couple of decades. There's been a lot of money going to drought recovery and drought resilience programs. Imagine as part of those programs, we'd actually created incentives for our farmers to set up seed production paddocks and to have that additional income coming in. And a thought to ponder is that $30 million has just been announced in the last budget for the carbon farming outreach program. And that's focused on reducing ag and land sector emissions. Imagine if we could build in seed production to look after the little guys that Sam will talk about later on, which is our grassland and forb species. And I suppose that final message is we need much more imagination and integration between the national programs we're delivering in this space for climate change and biodiversity. So Sam's work is amazing because she'll outline how we can still restore country even with the shortfalls in those understory species. And as well as Sam's work, there's been another rather critical papers that have been done and reports over the last 5 or 6 years. Brad will place some of them in the chat. We had a native seed industry report done in 2018, and then post the bushfires, there was a national seed strategy prepared. So we'll place those in the chat along with Sam's papers. Now, on to Sam. So Sam is an early career research ecologist. She's got a broad interest in conservation, restoration and management of natural ecosystems. And much of her works involve using ecological theories to approach applied problems in ecology, generating knowledge that can be directly applied to policy and practice. And I think this paper is a wonderful example of that. And pleasingly to me as a social scientist, Sam has a deep interest in the role of societal and cultural values and how we conserve and restore our ecosystems. She's multidisciplinary in the way she thinks and in the research she does. So while her research spans a variety of ecosystems, Sam's focuses on themes which include species traits, functional diversity, community assembly, global change, disturbance biology, fire ecology, and plant-soil interactions. It's an amazing bio, Sam. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Sam. We've opened the chat because the Q&A won't work for a lot of us internally on the Teams application. So please place your questions in the chat and we'll get to them after the seminar. It's also worth noting that we're actually going to be recording Sam's talk, and we have a YouTube channel, so you'll be able to share it within your networks for some of your colleagues that aren't here today, noting that it is school holidays. So I wanted to say thank you all for attending, and we're hoping that this will be the start of a very fruitful conversation about how we actually work in this space. So over to you, Sam.
Cool. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, so hi, my name's Sam, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to you guys today a little bit about all this research. And Kathy gave a really good overview. But yeah, I just thought I would give us a bit of background as to why this research is pretty timely and important. So many of us know that Australia is currently updating its strategy for nature. And this is the document that's going to be detailing our country's progress and work plan towards meeting these ambitious targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Specifically, this work pertains to Target 2, which is ensuring that 30% of ecosystems or degraded ecosystems are under effective restoration by 2030. So we're almost about halfway there. And this target encompasses about 1 billion hectares of degraded land that needs restoration globally. So that's quite a lot of space. And in order to effectively undertake this, we really need to be thinking about taking careful stock of the tools and capacity that we have as a nation to repair nature at this scale. And as many of us know, diverse native seed is the cornerstone of nature repair. And a lot of research suggests that seed is rarely available in the quantities that are desired by practitioners in order to undertake restoration at scale. And meanwhile, which is going to be the focus of this particular talk today, constraints on the diversity of species available for use in restoration have also been documented, suggesting that there might be a bit of a selection filter constraining the effective restoration of some species. And this could result in the reduced diversity of restored vegetation relative to an intended reference system. And so consequently, there's this need to preemptively quantify how constraints on seed diversity affect our capacity to implement efforts to restore biodiverse vegetation. And so in this study, we conducted a nationwide inventory of seed availability across Australia and summarized by 6 of its major vegetation types, which you can see down below. And I think it's important to note that we focused specifically on commercial seed availability for this study because these commercial seed providers are the primary providers that are going to be providing seed at the quantities that are going to be required for scalable restoration when it comes to these big targets for restoration. But conservation-based seed banks do host a breadth of very important biodiversity as well. And so in this study, we assessed commercial seed availability across the country, and we paired this data set to the nationwide Austraits database, which is a plant trait database. And we did this so that we could explore variation in the species richness, but also the functional breadth and ultimately the functional diversity of the pool of available seed relative to the total continental floral diversity. And for those of you that are less familiar with plant functional traits, these are measurable features which can capture variation in ecological strategies irrespective of species identification. And there's a lot of different metrics that you can derive from plant functional traits. And these are really useful because they can provide indicators of biodiversity and ecosystem function. And in this study, we focused on a particular diversity metric called functional dispersion. And you can think of this as the breadth of trait values in a plant community, or in the case of this study, in a seed mix designed for restoration. And we focused on functional dispersion specifically because higher levels of functional dispersion have been attributed to greater stability to environmental change, increased niche differentiation, or increased productivity. And these are all really interesting and important indicators to be thinking about when trying to restore biodiverse ecosystems. And so when we looked at the species and the breadth of functional traits within this commercial seed supply, what we found was that only about 12% of Australia's total continental floral richness is presently available as seed for immediate purchase. And that's about roughly 3,000 plant species. And you can see in this lower table, the proportion of species where seed was available differed between the vegetation types. So about 10% of rainforest and vine thicket species were available as seed, versus as high as almost 30% of heath and shrubland species were available as seed. And we also observed significant variation in the distribution and coverage of trait values based on seed availability. And in general, what we found was that species where seed was available, those species were generally taller, with larger leaves and larger seeds and thicker, longer-lived leaves. And we also found that the proportion of functional groups represented within each seed pool also differed. And you can see that quite clearly in this subset of our data from woodland ecosystems, whereby seed was more frequently available for your trees and shrubs on the right, and the understory species were more frequently less available as seed. And this has significant implications when we want to be thinking about restoring really biodiverse ecosystems where the majority of plant species diversity is located in the ground cover, such as the critically endangered Cumberland Plain woodland. So from these previous results, you can clearly see that there's a bit of a selection effect constraining the plant strategies that could be restored through planting. And to quantitatively assess this, we explored the degree to which functional diversity might be constrained by seed availability by simulating theoretical seed mixes derived from the available pool of seed, which we assessed in this study, relative to an unconstrained pool, assuming that all species could be planted and seed was readily available for those species. And when we ran these simulations, what we found was that functional dispersion was consistently lower when simulated from traits from species from solely the available seed pool relative to the total species pool. And this was consistent across all major vegetation types. But what we did find was that the effect of seed pool or seed constraints was strongest for eucalyptus dominated ecosystems and woodland ecosystems. And you can see that from the stars that I put on those little plots. And so solutions are urgently required to address seed shortfalls so that plantings are not only species rich, but also functionally diverse as we begin to be working towards these ambitious targets for nature repair. And in this study, we tried to interweave two strategies to try to overcome these constraints. And the first being to quantify and assess gaps in the national seed supply chain that currently limit the capacity for us to restore biodiverse vegetation. And I'm going to start by talking about this strategy. And to address this objective, we first took a bit more of an in-depth look at the diversity of species and growth forms that were offered by all the different suppliers that we characterized in this study. And what we found was that many of these suppliers operate currently on very small scales. So the number of species in available seed stock had quite a staggering range, from some suppliers holding as little as 26 species in their seed stock to some almost having 1,700 species. And as expected, which you can see in the lower panel of this figure, the supply proportion, the proportion of species in each supplier's supply tended to have greater representation among these woody species, so the trees and the shrubs. But what we found was that the seed supply richness didn't equate seed supply diversity. And so that is, as suppliers, as businesses scaled up to include more species in their seed offerings, that supply tended towards increased representation of woody species at the expense of understory species, and these became more diluted in seed stocks as businesses scaled up. And so for the second strategy, we thought we would explore whether or not we could make the most of the seed that we presently do have. And we did this by trying to incorporate a trait-informed species selection approach into our seed simulations. And so in order to do this, essentially we selected species that are located in the underrepresented regions of the trait space. And we elected to test this thought experiment on the two vegetation types that exhibited the greatest functional diversity deficit, which were the eucalyptus dominated and woodland vegetation types that I showed on the previous slide. Note that this is a much more data-driven approach towards doing this, predominantly for the purpose of science and the paper that we published. But a similar methodology could be undertaken in many different scenarios by thinking to incorporate a diverse representation of different traits, like the three we used in this study when designing seed mixes for restoration. You could think about including other traits like flowering traits to try to attract pollinators, different diverse groups of pollinators, or maybe thinking to include species of cultural value or food or habitat species for wildlife. There's lots of ways to think about how to better include diversity in a seed mix. But for the purpose of this study, we sort of had a bit more of a methodological approach. But what we found from doing this was that incorporating trait-informed species selection into our theoretical seed mixes, we were able to achieve functional diversity levels that were similar or higher than the unconstrained species pool. And you can see that where the two stars are, the 60% trait-informed species selection yielded very similar comparable functional dispersion levels to the total species pool that was unconstrained. And if you included even more of those species, you would get higher functional diversity levels. So yeah, there's definitely ways within these constraints of seed diversity where we can still achieve and maximize outcomes for diversity. And so while the global requirements to restore vegetation remain clear and aspirations around reversing environmental degradation are persuasive, the consequences of seed undersupply that we've outlined in this work must be considered and ultimately overcome to realize the goals for nature repair. And our study, and one way that we can overcome this is to think about strengthening the national seed supply chain. And so in the study, we provided a few calls to action that we think might help ensure that we have the tools required to effectively undertake these goals. And so one of these is to provide incentives to suppliers to help increase more diversity within their seed supply. we can think about trying to build capacity for increased representation of understory species in commercial seed banks, such as increasing support to help develop seed production areas for really difficult to harvest species. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we really need to be developing better lines of communication between seed demands and seed supply, because if a supplier can forecast demand for native seed well in advance, they may be able to supply that. But if we aren't communicating effectively, it's going to be really hard for us to achieve goals, these ambitious goals for restoration. So yeah, in summary, we observed some seed supply shortfalls, and this could pose a serious risk when restoration is being used to offset impacts on ecosystems at scale and the functions that they provide. And when seed was available, it tended to be for trees and shrubs at the expense of understory species. And these are growth forms which only represent a subset of the trait diversity in our Australian ecosystems. And yeah, overall, better coordination along the entire seed supply chain is really required to bring together disparate groups such as restoration practitioners, local communities, policymakers, business experts, and financiers to understand these constraints and design effective solutions going forward. And yeah, at the end of the day, even if we can organize the required tools, there's a lot of risks with nature repair, and we really need to be thinking about ways that we can build more capacity and better understand the best ways going forward, because it's not easy to restore an ecosystem. So I'll leave it at oh, I forgot about this slide. So I'll leave that part of the discussion there. But I thought I would throw a little bit of additional work that we're currently doing in case anyone has interest. In particular, we've been working quite heavily in trying to assess the costs and the benefits of different restoration methods, and trialing sort of new emerging technologies to try to restore ecosystems at scale. In particular, we've been looking at the use of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones to try to restore ecosystems. And we're also doing a lot of testing with something called seed enhancement technologies, which are basically seed pre-treatments that are applied to seeds before going out into the field to see if we can try to improve outcomes with native seeds and reduce wastage. And yeah, with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I'd really like to thank everyone who helped support this talk or support this research. In particular, this research has been supported by an Australian Research Council linkage grant, and I've also stuck a little link to the paper itself if anyone wanted to read anything in more detail that I haven't covered here. So thank you. Thanks for listening.
Mic on. Thanks so much, Sam. Lots of food for thought in there. What are you pre-treating? What are the pre-treatments using in that next stage of work you're doing?
That one? So we're doing a lot of different things. We've done some experiments with ways to help break dormancy for species that have physiological dormancy mechanisms, but the seed enhancement technology that we're using in particular is called a pellet-based technology. And so basically it's where the seed is sown within a organic substrate. And we've been trialing different things you can add to those substrates. We've been looking at if you can get comparable emergence outcomes, or how seed traits perhaps can be used to predict emergence outcomes in using seed enhancement technologies. And we've also recently done a study to look at how encapsulating seed influences seed predation take rates in restoration. So a couple different things that we're...
As a volunteer bush regenerator, we're all very interested in that. Now, back to the topic at hand, and I noticed one of our other partners, Bob Mackinson's online, and Bob's also posted in the chat a whole lot of resources. And just to note that the non-government plant conservation sector has been working on this issue for almost a decade. So the native seed report that we referred to earlier was released back in 2018. There was a whole lot of work done in 2016, and Bob's also posted links to the Flora Bank guidelines and other tools that help train and build capacity and share knowledge. So thanks, Bob, for throwing all that extra info in. So our first question, and I'm pretty sure from what Brad's telling me, because of the webinar, you guys can't actually, let me see, I've got Sam there, and I think Pauline there's Pauline. So it's from Pauline Sykes. Thanks, Pauline. So her question for you, Sam, is, so should we stop concentrating on selecting seed from particular traits for restoration and actually collect smaller samples of every style of plant in the collection area? So if they have seed, collect some of it, not just from the tall, straight, handsome specimens.
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Should we stop concentrating on selecting seed from particular traits for restoration and actually collect smaller samples of every style of plant in the collection area? So I think it's talking about understory, mid-story and upstory species. So if they have seed, collect some of it, not just from the tall, straight, handsome specimens. So they're talking about when they go out there and do that collection.
So collecting for banking or for seed production areas?
It hasn't actually said. Pauline, do you want to add to that question in the chat?
Because I guess that's one of the constraints for providing understory seed or seed from understory species at scale, is the fact that many of those individuals don't produce the same amount of seed per plant as, say, a eucalyptus tree or an acacia shrub or tree. And I think that's one of the big constraints with trying to provide scalable and diverse understory seed in supply. So I would caution against trying to collect large quantities of seed from understory species unless a small amount of that seed was being used to help support a seed orchard, mostly because I think the amount of remnant vegetation that is left for us to be collecting seeds from for many species is quite limited. And I really do think that building solutions where we can actually create scalable living seed banks is the best way forward. I don't know if that answers the question.
Look, Pauline's just clarified she was talking about for banking and use, and actually it makes more sense now. So she means, the traits of straight stemmed versus wonky trees and so on. And she does a lot of collecting for the, a lot of diversity for the job she's doing. And she does drone seeding for rehab with sets where she can.
Very cool.
Yeah. So collect the wonky ones as well. Okay, so Sam Craigie from Greening Australia. So Sam says to Sam, appreciate your research team bringing forward questions on the capacity of the Oz native seed sector to respond to increasing demand. This is a very good conversation to be having, and I think we all agree with that. There's been a few comments to that effect in the chat. Restoration seed banks and collectors respond to demand. If proponents are seeking higher levels of species diversity, it needs to come from the demand and customer, and the market can respond. Where there are technical gaps, conservation seed banks are positioned to contribute to capacity building. And I think that's kind of more of a statement that we can actually all agree on, Sam. But it is true that the industry as it is at the moment is responding to the demand, and I know that some of the programs that would have driven that demand, particularly for the tree species, would have been things like 1 million trees and others that have been operating over decades, because that's where the funding's been invested. And there's a very good paper on that we should find and pop in the chat, Brad, because it actually looks at the outcomes of those big, broad-scale tree planting programs and the outcomes for biodiversity conservation, which weren't fabulous. Okay, what else have we got in here? Cormac Farrell, g'day from Cormac. Cormac asks you, Sam, did you consider identifying species that require a specific plant-pollinator interaction in order to reproduce? And this is a topic very close to Cormac's heart as a bee man.
Yeah, so we did not consider pollination in the scope of this work, but yeah, as I mentioned, when thinking about diversity or designing a diverse seed mixture for restoration purposes, that is definitely something that you can consider. What else? Yeah, we also didn't really filter seeds based on certain requirements. So some seeds might not produce very well from seed and may be better produced via cuttings, like thinking about certain members of the Proteaceae, like Persunia, for example, are really difficult to propagate from seed. We didn't really consider that as well when looking at this, but that is another good point.
Thanks, Sam. And then I think this sort of builds on our previous comments. How do you think demand from the carbon planting sector is influencing the diversity of seeds collected, sold commercially?
Yep, that's definitely in the paper too. I think demand's definitely swung a bit towards tree-centric traits for a reason. But I do think that if we can more transparently communicate, current demands and forecast future demands, and work towards being able to build more diversity into our seed collections, I think that we'll be able to undertake more diverse plantings.
And that was Tim Westwood. Thanks for your question, Tim. And moving down to Martin William. Martin just wanted to add the importance in seed production that represents the globalized genetics from the region being restored. There are commercial growers that are taking seed from the Central Desert and growing it in other regions. So that's really probably more of a comment too, Sam, but an interesting one. And Kim Wilson. Interesting research and helps to continue to build the case of seed shortages in the future. Species diversity is important. Was genetic diversity considered as part of your research?
Genetic diversity was not considered in this study, but we did look within the different suppliers and pull out whether or not provenancing is something that the suppliers are able to accommodate, or if that's information that they do give alongside their various seed accessions. So we did consider provenance when we were doing this work, not at the species level, but more at the supplier level, because different practitioners may want to select seed from various provenances for various reasons. And so we did consider that.
Yeah, and Sam and a few other people, Sam Craig again, have asked how we as a research community contribute to improved conservation between native seed industry and stakeholders to enable better coordination and communication. We might refer to that at the end because there is a few ideas popping around about that. And Peter's asked, Sam, are there some species that are better able to self-propagate, so to perpetuate over time?
Ooh, that's a good question. Do you mean species with sort of like weedy qualities, weedy traits and weedy qualities?
Well, we know about those ones.
Because, yeah, I guess that's the thing, right? Is thinking about incorporating diversity when seeding for restoration is one thing, but then thinking about which species to plant first in a primary seeding effort is an entirely different question.
Yeah.
And that species pool may look very different to your target community. I have been trying to think of a way to design an experiment to test this, but I have not really yet come across the appropriate design. But I'm really quite interested in weedy natives and weedy native traits, and trying to think about ways that we can kickstart restoration using those more ruderal species. But yeah, I haven't gotten around to actually running that experiment yet, but it is very interesting.
It's an interesting dimension because I'd say as a bush regenerator that sometimes we hang on to our weedy acacia species because in times of drought they're holding the bank, they're providing habitat, they're providing,
Yep.
food sources for pollinators and wildlife. So yeah, we need a lot more work in that area.
And there's ground cover species and grasses that have that same quality that you can utilize in restoration too. And so I feel like that would be an interesting thing to push forward in research.
We have a problem with native herbivores there, which gets stuck into our native grass understory. And Kylie from the Holbrook Landcare Network, welcome Kylie, great to have some of our regional care and restoration community online. Kylie's asked, Sam, is there any research going on into seed quality as well as quantity? Seems this is an increasing issue, but is there any evidence base?
I am not doing a whole lot on quality besides doing checks before I use seed in the field. But I do know that some of the people that I have gotten seed from in the past for experiments do quality testing. There's also some research out there on storage conditions and how varying storage conditions affect seed quality as well. And someone from our group is also assessing whether how storage of seed affects things that affects the microbiome of the seed as well. So that's also quite interesting and something to, I guess, maybe keep your eyes on as research develops.
And what we'll actually do is identify all of these questions and issues, because if we're talking about next steps and things that we need to follow up and provide further advice to people, we can do that. And Pauline again. So Pauline's wearing her other hat now, which is her local Landcare group, has expressed interest in seed production areas. Is there some help we could access for workshops, etc., to inform and help develop these? Very good question, Pauline.
Is there, some help we could access for workshops?
To help people set up seed production areas in their regions.
That's a good question. That would actually be a really valuable workshop to set up at some point. Perhaps we can talk with people from...
Yeah, I think it's another one. Like we're kind of addressing all of these issues from a capacity and supply side. Martin's
the people from Greening Australia in Richmond have a really lovely seed production area, and perhaps maybe they might have some interest in running a workshop for the key things to think about. I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm going up to see Sam in a couple of weeks' time, so we can chat about that. It's a really, really pertinent question, because I have a lot of friends that actually own properties that would be quite, they've already set aside paddocks and riparian areas for biodiversity conservation and would be quite interested in seed production. And John Hope's asked, Sam, I would welcome your comments on how the communication from the demand restoration side to the supply collection production side could be improved.
I think being able to have maybe like an open access tool where people can maybe input some of their seed that they've used for restoration, their orders, or people can, put in things that they've collected, some kind of, open user framework where we can actually see, what are the people requesting or wanting or using, and what are people collecting, propagating, something where we can kind of begin to look from both sides, because I may want seed from one species, but I may be able to see that a similar species with similar traits or that serves a similar function that's also native to the site that I'm trying to restore may be available. So it can kind of help us vice versa better communicate the supply and demand. I don't know. That's one idea, but I'm sure there's other ways that we can overcome this too.
Yeah, and I think that also leads into needing to have that broader conversation to look at what's the tools we need. And we're talking, across different scales here too, because we have sort of land care people involved in care, then we're going to have major, landscape scale restoration happening as well. So we need to be kind of looking after all of those sectors that are involved in the space. We've only got a few minutes left, and there's lots of questions in here. So I think what that sort of demonstrates is the need for another conversation, which I think we all knew that would be the case. So I'll just get to Lauren's because it's next in the list. And she's saying, Sam, it's so fascinating that we can actually obtain the diversity in plant functional roles by what's available currently in the commercial seed stock. And I think that's the amazing sort of very creative solution from your research. One of the big hurdles we see in revegetation is the successful planting of the understory and ground cover species over large areas where there are very competitive and invasive exotic ground covers at degraded sites.
Yep.
Do you know of any research or programs that may better bridge the gap between available nursery seed and plants and successful planting in degraded sites?
I guess this piggybacks on this experiment that I keep thinking about where I test lots of different native understory species, trying to find the ones that are going to be the best competitors. So there's a lot of work in this space of priority effects in ecological restoration, which is essentially giving priority to species that maybe have by planting them early, but looking at germination and looking at individuals that have very rapid and quick emergence from seed, and thinking about trying to include sort of those weedy species in restoration. And I've trialed a few species around the Sydney region, and I've been able to find a few that perform really well. But I'd like to test this further.
Well, we're definitely going to get you back to talk about that work, Sam. And there's just one, we'll just get to last is Peter's question is, do you have any thoughts on re-veg sequence? That is, should overstory come first or the ground layer?
I don't have any thoughts on this. That is also something I wanted to test at some point. But yeah, I think it really depends on the site and probably the conditions of the site, and the understory species that you're looking to restore. If they're very shade, or if they are intolerant to full sun, so some of those understory species may be better to plant at a later successional stage. So this idea of successional planting when it comes to restoration is definitely something I'm interested in, but I have very limited experience actually doing this on the ground, so hard for me to provide too much advice.
So thanks, Sam.